Miss Marple and the People Who Disappear in the Dark. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm your host, Ailey, and I cannot tell you how much joy it brings me to know you choose to spend your evenings with these stories. Each tale takes time and love to prepare, but your kindness and the way our little community grows make it all so meaningful. Thank you for being such a wonderful audience. If you haven't yet, do subscribe so you never miss a new mystery. Now, let's gently turn the page and begin tonight's story. Chapter 1. Between Two Lamps. The October rain had been particularly unkind to St. Mary Mead that year. What should have been a golden season of harvest suppers and village celebrations had dissolved into a series of soggy disappointments. With the annual festivities postponed indefinitely, and the good folk of the village huddling indoors with their disappointments and their tea, it was on such a dreary evening that Miss Jane Marple found herself listening with particular attention to a most curious tale being recounted in the sitting room of the vicarage. The Reverend Leonard Clement and his wife Griselda had invited several of the village worthies for what Griselda cheerfully termed a council of war regarding the increasingly troublesome matter of Stile Lane. 3 weeks now, declared Lady Bantry, adjusting her foxstole with characteristic emphasis. 3 whole weeks that wretched stretch has been black as pitch. Between lamppost 14 and 15, is it not? She inquired mildly. Precisely, confirmed the vicar, pushing his spectacles up his nose. The council assures us it's merely a temporary matter. But temporary seems to have acquired a rather elastic definition of late. Stile Lane was nothing more than a narrow strip of road that wound between high hawthorn hedges, connecting the main village street to the common beyond. During daylight hours, it presented no particular challenge to pedestrians. But after dark, the absence of illumination between the two lampposts created what the more dramatic residents had begun calling the mouth of darkness. It was Constable Sanders who had brought the matter to the vicar's attention, though his own assessment seemed curiously lackadaisical. Council will see to it in due course, he had assured everyone who inquired. These things take time, they do. But time, as it happened, was beginning to reveal some rather disturbing patterns. Molly Archer was the first, said Griselda, her voice dropping to the conspiratorial tone she reserved for the most intriguing village gossip. You know Molly, the little seamstress who lives above Mrs. Pike's shop. Sweet girl, never a moment's trouble, Miss Marple nodded. She knew Molly well. A quiet young woman who carried herself with the careful dignity of someone who had learned early to make her own way in the world. What exactly happened to her? Asked Lady Bantry. Griselda leaned forward. She was walking home from the Mothers' Union meeting, taking her usual route through Stile Lane. It was perhaps 8. Full dark, of course. She swears that as she approached the unlit section, she saw what she described as a door-shaped darkness opening in the hedge. A door? Miss Marple's needles paused for just a moment. Her very words, Griselda continued. A man's voice whispered, "This way to the vicarage." And the next thing she knew, she was waking up near Much Benham Depot with a dreadful headache and her handbag missing. The vicar frowned. Much Benham is a good 4 miles from here. Indeed it is, agreed Griselda. Poor Molly had to walk all the way back, and she arrived home well after midnight in a most distressed state. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, but her pale blue eyes held a thoughtful expression. Did she report this to Constable Sanders? Oh, yes, but he seemed to think she might have had a tumble and confused herself. You know how these head injuries can be, Lady Bantry snorted. Sanders wouldn't recognize a genuine mystery if it knocked on his door with a written introduction. The second incident occurred the following week, continued Griselda. Ted Elkins, the delivery cyclist from Hogg's Grocery, he remembers even less than Molly. Just a sensation of being pulled and a strong smell of canvas. He came to his senses on the common, bruised about the shoulders and thoroughly bewildered, Was anything taken from him? Inquired Miss Marple. His bicycle was missing, though it turned up the next day propped against the churchyard wall. The curious thing was his delivery basket was empty, though he swears it contained 3 pounds of butter, a joint of beef, and a bottle of Mrs. Carmichael's elderflower wine when he started his rounds. The vicar shook his head sadly. Poor Ted. He had to make good on the missing items from his own pocket. And now, said Lady Bantry grimly, we come to last night. A somber silence fell over the little gathering. Even Griselda's usual animation seemed subdued as she took up the tale. Amos Keene, she said quietly. You all know Amos, the rent collector. Miss Marple did indeed know Amos Keene, though she could not say she found him a particularly sympathetic character. A small, furtive man who seemed to take an unsightly pleasure in his position of minor authority, collecting rents for several of the village landlords with what many considered unnecessary officiousness. He failed to return home last night, the vicar explained. Mrs. Keene waited up until past midnight, then came round to ask if we'd seen him. This morning, young Jimmy Fletcher found a body at the bottom of the old chalk pit. Dr. Haydock confirmed it was Amos. The poor man appears to have fallen, fracturing his skull. Lady Bantry shifted uncomfortably. Rather a coincidence, don't you think? 3 incidents in 3 weeks, all involving that wretched dark stretch of lane. Miss Marple's knitting had stilled entirely now. Dr. Haydock believes it was an accident. He seems satisfied that death was caused by the fall, the vicar replied carefully. Though I must say it's a curious place for Amos to have been wandering. Perhaps he was confused, suggested Griselda. If something similar happened to him as befell Molly and Ted, he might have wandered about in a dazed state. Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle clicking. I wonder if I might take a walk down Stile Lane tomorrow evening. Before full dark, of course. Lady Bantry looked at her friend with concern. My dear Jane, surely that's not wise given recent events. Oh, I think I shall be quite safe, Dolly. After all, whatever has been happening seems to occur after full darkness has fallen, and I find that one can learn a great deal by observing a place at different times and in different lights. The vicar nodded approvingly. I'm sure Miss Marple's keen eye will spot anything that the rest of us have missed. As the evening drew to its close, and the little gathering began to disperse, Miss Marple found herself walking slowly home through the village streets, her mind turning over the curious details of the 3 incidents. There was something about the whole business that struck her as distinctly odd, though she could not yet put her finger on precisely what it was. The rain had stopped, and a pale moon was struggling to break through the clouds. As she passed the entrance to Stile Lane, Miss Marple paused and peered down the darkened path. Between the 2 lamp-posts, the darkness seemed almost solid, like a curtain drawn across the way. Tomorrow, she decided, she would take that walk, and perhaps she would ask Dolly to accompany her. 2 pairs of eyes, after all, were often better than one. Chapter 2. Guests and Whispers. The drawing-room of Langley Manor had been transformed into an elegant reception area where guests gathered before the ceremony, creating the sort of animated tableau that Tuppence always found fascinating to observe. Crystal glasses caught the light from the tall windows, and the gentle murmur of conversation filled the air with anticipation. Rather like watching a stage play, isn't it? Tommy remarked quietly, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing footman. Everyone performing their assigned roles. Tuppence smiled at her husband's observation. And what role are we playing, do you suppose? The interested observers, naturally, Tommy replied, though I suspect we may find ourselves cast as something rather more active before the day is through. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Aunt Winifred, who descended upon them with the determined air of someone who had appointed herself chief distributor of gossip and general information. Such a lovely couple, You too, she declared, though her eyes were already scanning the room for her next target. I do hope you've heard about Clara's previous engagements. 3, you know, though one hardly likes to mention such things on a wedding day. Tuppence raised an eyebrow with practiced innocence. 3 engagements? How unfortunate that they didn't work out. Well, the first was young Lord Putin. Dreadful gambling debts, you understand. The second was that American, Mr. Harrison, but there were questions about his business dealings. Aunt Winifred lowered her voice conspiratorially. And the third? The third was actually Edward's cousin, Geoffrey. Rather awkward that, given today's circumstances. Tommy found this information distinctly interesting. Geoffrey Langley? I don't believe we've met him. Oh, he's here somewhere, Aunt Winifred said easily, waving her gloved hand toward the far end of the room. Tall, dark fellow with a rather brooding expression. I must say it takes considerable fortitude to attend your former fiancé's wedding to your own cousin. As if summoned by their conversation, a man fitting Aunt Winifred's description appeared at the edge of their group. Geoffrey Langley possessed the same aristocratic features as Edward, though where Edward's face showed pleasant openness, Geoffrey bore the marks of someone who had experienced disappointment. Good morning, Geoffrey said with careful politeness, though his smile seemed somewhat forced. I don't believe we've been introduced, Geoffrey Langley, said Aunt Winifred briskly. After the appropriate introductions, Tommy ventured carefully into conversation. Splendid day for a wedding. You must be delighted for your cousin. Indeed, Geoffrey replied, though his tone suggested anything but delight. Edward has always been fortunate in his choices. The comment hung in the air with uncomfortable weight, and Tuppence quickly changed the subject. The manor is beautiful. Have you lived here long? I grew up here, actually. Edward inherited when our uncle passed, but I spent many childhood summers exploring these grounds. Geoffrey's expression softened slightly with memory. Clara always loved the old chapel. She said it reminded her of a fairy tale. Before anyone could respond to this revealing comment, Mrs. Penrose materialized beside them with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Mr. Geoffrey, if you could take your place with the other ushers, please. The processional will be beginning shortly. Her tone brooked no argument, though she managed to make it sound like a pleasant request. As Geoffrey moved away, Tuppence caught Tommy's eye meaningfully. The undercurrents in this gathering were becoming more apparent with each conversation. Their attention was drawn to Mr. Philip Carow, who seemed to be holding court near the fireplace with several other guests. His charming manner was in full display as he regaled them with what appeared to be an amusing anecdote, though Tuppence noted that his eyes frequently strayed toward the doorway where Clara would presumably make her entrance. Fascinating fellow, Carol, observed a voice beside them. They turned to find Miss Eleanor Dale, a quiet presence whose observations somehow seemed more significant. He's been asking rather a lot of questions about the Worthington family. Finances. Tommy's detective instincts sharpened immediately. Has he indeed? In what context? Oh, very casual, of course. Wondering about Clara's inheritance from her late father, that sort of thing. Though I couldn't help but notice he seemed particularly interested in the details of the trust fund. This information added another layer to the growing complexity of relationships surrounding this wedding. Tuppence filed it away alongside Aunt Winifred's revelations about Clara's romantic history. The conversation was interrupted by a minor commotion near the entrance. James the butler was engaged in what appeared to be a heated whispered discussion with one of the younger footmen. The older man's usual composure seemed somewhat strained, and Tommy noticed how he kept glancing toward the chapel with apparent concern. I wonder what's troubling James, Tuppence murmured. Before Tommy could respond, Margaret Langley approached their group with purposeful strides. Edward's sister had changed from her earlier dress into a becoming gown of pale rose silk, though her expression remained somewhat troubled. I don't suppose either of you has seen Clara recently? Margaret asked without preamble. Mrs. Penrose is growing rather anxious about the timing, and the bride seems to have disappeared. Disappeared? Tommy's interest was immediately piqued. When was she last seen? About 20 minutes ago. She went upstairs to make final adjustments to her veil. But when Mrs. Penrose sent her assistant to check, Clara's dressing room was empty. Tuppence glanced around the drawing room, noting which guests were present and which were not. Perhaps she stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. Pre-wedding nerves, you know. Possibly, Margaret agreed, though she didn't sound convinced. Though it's not like Clara to be inconsiderate of others' schedules. She's usually quite punctual. The sound of rapid footsteps on marble announced Mrs. Penrose's arrival, her professional calm showing definite signs of strain. She approached Margaret with barely concealed urgency. Any word from Miss Worthington? The wedding planner inquired, her voice low but tense. Nothing yet. We were just discussing possible locations. Mrs. Penrose's lips compressed into a thin line. This is most irregular. The photographer is waiting. The musicians are ready, and we have a chapel full of guests expecting to begin promptly. Tommy noticed how several nearby conversations had begun to falter as guests became aware of the developing situation. The atmosphere of happy anticipation was gradually giving way to something more uncertain. Mr. Caro detached himself from his group and approached with apparent concern. Is there some difficulty? The bride seems to have wandered off, Margaret explained with forced lightness. I'm sure it's nothing serious. Of course not, Caro agreed smoothly, though Tommy detected something calculating in his expression. Though I did notice someone in a white dress walking toward the garden path earlier, through the French doors. This information prompted immediate action. Mrs. Penrose dispatched footmen to search the grounds, while Margaret organized a more systematic check of the manor's interior rooms. As the search party dispersed, Tommy and Tuppence found themselves momentarily alone in the drawing room with Miss Eleanora Dale and Aunt Winifred. Most peculiar behavior for a bride, Aunt Winifred declared with obvious relish. In my day, young ladies didn't simply vanish on their wedding morning. Miss Dale's quiet voice cut through Aunt Winifred's commentary. I couldn't help but notice that Geoffrey Langley disappeared around the same time as Clara. The implications of this observation hung heavy in the air, and Tommy felt the familiar stirring of investigative curiosity that had served them so well in previous adventures. Well, then, Tuppence said quietly, perhaps we should take a stroll through the gardens ourselves. After all, it's such a lovely morning for a walk. Tommy nodded, understanding perfectly. Whatever was happening at Langley Manor, it seemed increasingly clear that this wedding might not proceed according to plan. And if there was indeed a mystery brewing, Tommy and Tuppence Beresford intended to be ready for it. Chapter 3. Miss Marple Notices. Tar and Chalk. The morning dawned clear and bright, with that particular quality of light that October sometimes bestows upon the English countryside. Miss Marple had risen early, as was her custom, and after a simple breakfast of toast and marmalade, she collected her knitting bag and set out for Stile Lane once more. This time she went alone, preferring the solitude that often proved conducive to careful observation. Lady Bantry, though well-meaning, had a tendency toward dramatic exclamations that could prove distracting when one was attempting to piece together the subtle details of a puzzle. The morning traffic was light, consisting mainly of Farmer Giles with his milk cart and Mrs. Carmichael cycling to her post office. Miss Marple exchanged pleasant greetings with both, but her attention remained focused on the task at hand. At lamppost 14, she paused to examine more closely the hawthorn thorn where her glove had snagged the previous evening. In the clear morning light, she could see that several other small fibers clung to the surrounding branches. all of them bearing the same coarse, blackened texture as the fragment she'd collected. Drawing her knitting magnifier from her bag, Miss Marple subjected one of these fibers to careful scrutiny. Under magnification, the material revealed itself to be unmistakably canvas, its weave heavy and practical, flecked with what appeared to be coal dust or some similar dark residue. Tarred canvas, she murmured to herself, recognizing the distinctive characteristics of the waterproof material used to cover loads on commercial vehicles, and recently torn, by the looks of it. She made her way along the hedge, examining both the thorny barrier itself and the narrow strip of verge that separated it from the roadway. The ground here was still soft from the recent rains, and Miss Marple found herself grateful for this small mercy, as it had preserved certain impressions that might otherwise have been lost. Near the base of lamppost 14, she discovered something that made her pause and look more carefully. The metal post itself bore at head height a small smudge of what appeared to be grease, or some similar substance, dark and slightly sticky to the touch. The mark was positioned precisely where someone might lean their hand while sighting a target or gauging a distance. But it was what she found at the base of the same post that truly captured her attention. Scattered in the grass and weeds that grew around the lamp's foundation was a fine dusting of pale powder, almost white, that had somehow escaped being washed away by the recent rains. Miss Marple knelt carefully, her aged joints protesting slightly, and gathered a small sample of the powder on the tip of her finger. It felt chalky to the touch, with a slightly gritty texture that was not unpleasant. But when she held it up to catch the morning sunlight, she noticed something quite remarkable. The powder possessed a faint luminescence, barely perceptible in the bright daylight, but unmistakably present. "Luminous chalk," she said softly, brushing the residue from her fingers with careful attention to detail. "The sort Boy Scouts use for marking trails, or cyclists for marking their routes in the dark." The implications of this discovery were not lost on her. Someone had been using luminous chalk to mark specific positions around lamppost 14, creating reference points that would be visible in darkness, but nearly invisible during daylight hours. Miss Marple rose slowly and began to walk the length of the dark stretch, examining the ground with methodical precision. Halfway between the two lampposts, she found additional traces of the luminous powder, this time scattered near what appeared to be the gate stone that marked the entrance to Farmer Henderson's lower field. She crossed to examine this stone more closely and found, to her satisfaction, that it too bore traces of the luminous material, applied in what seemed to be a small, deliberate mark at precisely the height one might expect to find the rear of a commercial vehicle. "Most interesting," she observed to a robin that had perched nearby to watch her investigations. "Someone has been taking great care to establish exact measurements between these 2 points." Her attention was drawn next to a small depression in the earth near the gate stone, partially obscured by the overgrowth of grass and weeds, but still discernible to a careful observer. The depression was roughly rectangular, approximately the width that might be made by the rear wheels of a heavy vehicle that had been backed into position and then driven away. Miss Marple followed the faint traces of this disturbance back toward the roadway, where they merged with the harder surface and became indistinguishable from the general traffic patterns. But their direction was clear enough, leading directly toward the main road that connected St. Mary Mead with the neighboring villages and ultimately with the larger commercial centers where a vehicle might easily lose itself among the general traffic. It was while examining this area that Miss Marple made her next significant discovery. Caught in the coarse grass that grew beside the road was another fragment of the black canvas material. This one larger than the previous specimens and bearing unmistakable signs of having been recently torn from some larger piece. But more intriguing still was what accompanied this fragment. Wrapped around it as if the two had been torn away together was a short length of cord tied off with the sort of neat, precise knot that spoke of maritime training or professional experience in the handling of ropes and tackle. Miss Marple examined this cordage with particular interest, noting the quality of the rope itself and the distinctive manner in which it had been finished. The end had been whipped with a smaller line to prevent fraying, a technique that required both skill and patience to execute properly. Naval training, she mused, or perhaps experience with commercial transportation, someone who knows the proper way to secure a load. She was about to continue her examination when the sound of an approaching vehicle caused her to look up. A lorry was making its way down the main road, moving at a steady pace that suggested local rather than through traffic. The vehicle slowed as it neared her position, and Miss Marple found herself looking up at the familiar figure of Horace Fleet, the local haulage contractor and builder's merchant. Mr. Fleet was a substantial man in his 50s, with a sort of florid complexion that suggested either good health or good living, possibly both. "Morning, Miss Marple," he called out cheerfully from his elevated position in the cab. "Out for a constitutional, are we?" "Good morning, Mr. Fleet," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "Yes, I find the morning air quite invigorating after yesterday's rain." Fleet's gaze took in her position near the entrance to Stile Lane, and his expression grew slightly more serious. "Terrible business about poor Keene," he said, shaking his head. "Makes one think twice about wandering about after dark." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, "though I understand you've been most helpful in providing temporary lighting for the area?" Fleet nodded vigorously. "Least I could do under the circumstances. Lent one of my portable lanterns to help with the milk deliveries. Can't have people stumbling about in the dark, especially with all these peculiar goings-on." "Most considerate of you," Miss Marple agreed. "I don't suppose you've noticed anything unusual in your travels, with your lorry routes taking you past here at various hours?" Fleet appeared to consider this carefully. "Can't say as I have, Miss Marple, though I must admit most of my evening runs take me well clear of this particular stretch. The main roads are more convenient for the sort of loads I carry." Miss Marple nodded understandingly. "Of course. Well, I mustn't keep you from your work." As Fleet's lorry resumed its journey, Miss Marple found herself studying its departing form with thoughtful attention. The vehicle was a substantial one, well-maintained and clearly capable of carrying considerable loads. Its rear was fitted with the sort of canvas tarpaulin covering that was standard for commercial haulage, secured with ropes and toggles against the elements. But it was something else about the departing lorry that caught and held her attention. From her position on the ground, she had an excellent view of the vehicle's undercarriage, and what she saw there confirmed a suspicion that had been growing in her. Mind the rear axle configuration was precisely what would be needed to create the sort of shallow crescent-shaped impressions she had observed in the soft earth near the gatestone. The spacing was correct, the depth appropriate, and the angle of approach exactly what one would expect from a vehicle backing carefully into position between predetermined markers. Miss Marple gathered her things and prepared to continue her investigation. There was still much to be learned, and she had the distinct feeling that the most important discoveries lay ahead. Chapter 4. A Fuse. That walked to Inspector Slack arrived in St. Mary Mead that afternoon with his characteristic air of barely contained irritation and a marked reluctance to consider that the recent incident might constitute anything more than an unfortunate series of coincidences. Miss Marple encountered him outside the post office, where he was engaged in what appeared to be a rather one-sided conversation with Constable Sanders. "Ah, Miss Marple," Inspector Slack said with a sort of weary resignation that suggested he anticipated interference in his official duties. "I suppose you've been taking your usual interest in matters that don't concern you." "Good afternoon, Inspector," Miss Marple replied mildly. "I have indeed been taking my morning walks as is my custom." I find the exercise most beneficial. Inspector Slack's expression suggested he found her constitutional habits less than fascinating. Well, I trust you'll leave the investigating to those properly qualified to conduct it. We've had quite enough amateur theorizing about these incidents. Naturally, Miss Marple agreed. Though I wonder if you might satisfy an old woman's curiosity about the electrical arrangements in Style Lane. I've been puzzling over why that particular section should remain unlit for so long. Constable. Sanders shifted uncomfortably. As I've explained to everyone who's asked, it's a matter for the council. These repairs take time. Indeed, said Miss Marple, but I understand the fault lies specifically with lamppost 15. I wonder if you've examined the mechanism yourself, Inspector? There was something in Miss Marple's tone that suggested this was not merely idle curiosity, and Inspector Slack found himself reluctantly intrigued, despite his initial inclination to dismiss her concerns. Come along, then, he said briskly. We'll have a look at this famous lamppost and settle the matter once and for all. The small procession made its way to Style Lane, where lamppost 15 stood at the far end of the darkened stretch, its failure to illuminate creating the ominous gap that had become the focus of so much village. Anxiety, Inspector Slack produced a key ring from his pocket and selected what appeared to be a standard utility key. Council provides these to all the local contractors, he explained, inserting it into the small iron door set into the base of the post. Routine maintenance and such. The door swung open with a rusty squeak, revealing the compact electrical compartment within. Inspector Slack peered inside, then straightened with a frown. That's odd, he muttered, reaching into the compartment. The cartridge fuse is missing entirely. Miss Marple stepped closer, though she was careful not to interfere with the inspector's examination. Missing, you say? Completely gone. And what's this? Inspector Slack withdrew his hand, holding between his fingers a length of wire that appeared to have been crudely installed as a temporary replacement. Someone's rigged up a makeshift connection. Constable Sanders looked genuinely surprised. That wasn't there when I checked last week, Inspector. When exactly did you check? Inspector Slack's tone had become decidedly sharper. Tuesday morning, it was. The fuse was blown right enough, but it was still in place. I made a note to report it to the council. Miss Marple examined the improvised wiring with interest. How curious. Someone appears to have removed the proper fuse and substituted this temporary arrangement. But surely such a repair would restore the light. Inspector Slack tested the makeshift connection gingerly. Not if it was deliberately done wrong. This wire has been positioned to look like a repair, but it wouldn't carry current properly. More of a disguise than a genuine fix. A disguise for what purpose? To make it look like someone had attempted a repair, presumably to cover up the fact that the original fuse was deliberately removed. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. I see. So someone with access to the proper key could remove the fuse, install this false repair, and ensure that the lamp remained dark while appearing to be merely faulty. That's about the size of it. Inspector Slack closed the compartment door with considerably more force than necessary. The question is, who would have such access and such knowledge? Constable Sanders cleared his throat nervously. Well, Inspector, any of the local contractors would have keys. The council issues them as a matter of course. Which contractors specifically? Oh, the usual suspects. Horace Fleet from the haulage company, young Morrison from the electrical firm, Hutchins, who does the road maintenance. Miss Marple's attention had been drawn to something else entirely. While the two policemen continued their discussion, she'd been examining the ground around the base of the lamppost, and what she discovered there proved most illuminating. Inspector, she said quietly, I believe you should see this. Both men turned to observe what had captured her attention. In the soft earth near the post foundation, clearly visible despite the passage of several days, were the unmistakable marks left by someone kneeling beside the electrical compartment. Knee prints, Inspector Slack observed. Recent ones, by the look of them. And see here, Miss Marple indicated a small depression in the earth nearby. Someone set down a tool or container of some sort while they worked. The impression is quite distinct. The inspector crouched to examine the marks more closely. You're right. Someone spent considerable time here working on that compartment. This wasn't a quick sabotage job. Miss Marple straightened slowly, her mind already moving to the next logical question. I wonder, Inspector, if you might inquire which of the local contractors has reported lending lighting equipment to assist with the milk deliveries during this period of darkness. Lighting equipment. Portable lanterns, I believe. Someone has been most thoughtfully providing temporary illumination, while the official repairs remain delayed. Inspector Slack's expression grew thoughtful. That's an interesting point, Miss Marple. Someone removes the fuse to ensure the lamp stays dark, then helpfully provides alternative lighting. Rather convenient, wouldn't you say? Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, though I'm sure it was offered with the best of intentions. They made their way back toward the village center, each occupied with their own thoughts about these new developments. As they passed Fleet's haulage yard, Miss Marple noted that several large tarpaulins were stretched over stacks of building materials, their black surfaces weathered by exposure to the elements. Inspector, she said as they paused at the yard's entrance, might I suggest a brief word with Mr. Fleet? Since he was kind enough to provide lighting assistance, he might have observed something useful during his evening visits to the area. Inspector Slack nodded grimly. My thoughts exactly, Miss Marple. They found Horace Fleet in his office, a cluttered space that spoke of a man more comfortable with practical matters than paperwork. He greeted them with apparent pleasure, though Miss Marple detected a certain weariness behind his hearty manner. Inspector Slack, Miss Marple, what brings you to my humble establishment? Just following up on a few details about the recent incidents in Stile Lane, Inspector Slack replied. I understand you've been providing lighting assistance in the area. Fleet nodded readily. Least I could do under the circumstances. Couldn't have people stumbling about in the dark, especially poor Farmer Giles with his early morning deliveries. Very public-spirited of you, Miss Marple observed. I don't suppose you noticed anything unusual during your visits to set up the lighting? Fleet appeared to consider this carefully. Can't say as I did, Miss Marple, though I must admit I didn't linger about the place after dark. Set up the lantern and got myself home to a warm fireside quick as could be. Inspector Slack produced the key ring he'd used to open the lamppost compartment. I suppose as a contractor you'd have one of these council keys? Oh yes, standard issue for anyone doing maintenance work. Fleet reached into his desk drawer and produced a similar key ring. Duplicate for the council, they call it, though I can't say I've had occasion to use mine recently. Miss Marple examined the keys with polite interest. How many people would you estimate have access to such keys, Mr. Fleet? Hard to say exactly. Any legitimate contractor, certainly. The electrical firms, road maintenance, anyone who might need access for repairs. Fleet paused thoughtfully. Though I suppose it's worth noting that not everyone who has a key necessarily knows how to use it properly. Takes a bit of electrical knowledge to understand what you're looking at inside those compartments. As they left Fleet Yard, Inspector Slack found himself regarding Miss Marple with grudging respect. You seem to have developed some rather specific theories about this business, Miss Marple. Oh, I wouldn't say theories, Inspector. Merely observations. Though I must confess, I'm beginning to suspect that our mysterious incidents may be rather more methodical than they first appeared. Chapter 5. Lorry Cords. The trucker's hitch the next morning brought Miss Marple an unexpected opportunity to observe Mrs. Fleet in action. She had been returning from her weekly visit to the lending library when she happened upon Fleet's timber dray parked outside Hutchins' carpentry shop, where Mrs. Fleet was engaged in securing a load of freshly cut planks with practiced efficiency. Miss Marple paused to watch, ostensibly to admire the handsome chestnut mare that drew the dray. But in reality, fascinated by the deft movements of Mrs. Fleet's capable hands as she worked with rope and tarpaulin. Bess Fleet was a woman of perhaps 45, with a practical bearing that spoke of a lifetime spent managing the details that kept a business running smoothly. Her movements as she arranged the tarpaulin over the lumber were economical and precise, each motion serving a clear purpose. What particularly caught Miss Marple's attention was the manner in which Mrs. Fleet secured the covering. Her hands moved with the fluid confidence of long practice, creating a complex arrangement of loops and hitches that would hold the load secure against any reasonable combination of wind and weather. "Good morning, Mrs. Fleet," Miss Marple called pleasantly. "What beautiful work you make of that knot." Mrs. Fleet glanced up from her task, her weathered face creasing into a smile. "Morning, Miss Marple. Kind of you to say so, though it's nothing fancy. Just a trucker's hitch my father taught me years ago." "Your father was in transportation?" "Merchant marine," Mrs. Fleet replied, returning to her work. "Sailed out of Portsmouth for 30 years before settling down to keep a chandler's shop. Always said there was no point in owning rope if you couldn't make it sing when you pulled it tight." Miss Marple moved closer to observe the knot more carefully. The arrangement was indeed complex, involving what appeared to be a series of interlocking loops that created a mechanical advantage, allowing a relatively modest pull on the working end to generate considerable tension in the securing line. "How ingenious," she observed. "I imagine such knowledge would be quite valuable in your husband's business." "Oh, Horace leaves all the load securing to me," Mrs. Fleet said with evident pride. "Says I've got the touch for it. Been teaching the other ladies at the Women's Institute, though I must say some of them find it rather challenging." Mrs. Fleet completed her work by whipping the bitter end of the rope with a smaller cord, creating a neat finish that would prevent the line from fraying with use. The technique was executed with the sort of automatic precision that comes from years of repetition. "There," she said, stepping back to survey her handiwork. "That'll hold fast until kingdom come." "It will," agreed Miss Marple, examining the completed arrangement with genuine admiration. "I don't suppose you've been missing any of your rope lately? I found an interesting piece in Style Lane yesterday, and I've been wondering about its origins." Mrs. Fleet's hand stilled for just a moment before she resumed gathering her tools. "Missing rope? Can't say as I have, Miss Marple, though we do get through a fair amount in the business. Always bits and pieces left about after a job." "Of course," Miss Marple continued. "This particular piece had a rather distinctive finish, whipped at the end, much like what you've just demonstrated." "Well, anyone who knows proper rope work would finish their ends that way," Mrs. Fleet replied reasonably. "Wouldn't do to leave them fraying about. Dangerous, that is, and wasteful besides." Miss Marple nodded agreement. "Quite right. Though I must say your technique has a particularly neat appearance, almost nautical in its precision." Something flickered across Mrs. Fleet's expression, gone almost before Miss Marple could register it. "Father always said there was a right way and a wrong way to handle rope. No sense in doing a thing halfway." As Mrs. Fleet prepared to drive away, Miss Marple found herself studying the dray's equipment with new interest. Hanging from hooks along the vehicle's side were several coils of rope in various thicknesses, along with an assortment of what appeared to be bone or wooden toggles used for securing tarpaulin grommets. "Mrs. Fleet," she called out as the other woman gathered the reins, "I don't suppose one of those toggles might have worked loose recently. I found what looked like a broken one caught in the hedge." Mrs. Fleet glanced back at her equipment, making a quick visual inventory. "Can't say I've noticed any missing, but they do break from time to time. Bone isn't as strong as it once was, what with rationing and all." After the dray departed, Miss Marple made her way back to Style Lane for another examination of the hedge. where she discovered the fragment of whipped cord. In the clear morning light, she was able to locate additional evidence that had escaped her previous notice. Caught on a thorn some distance from her original find was indeed a broken toggle, fashioned from what appeared to be carved bone, and showing the sort of wear that suggested regular use. One end had snapped cleanly, leaving a sharp edge that bore traces of the same black canvas material she had found elsewhere. More intriguingly, the pattern of damage to the surrounding hedge suggested that something substantial had been pulled away with considerable force, leaving broken twigs and torn leaves in a roughly rectangular pattern that extended from ground level to a height of approximately 7 feet. Miss Marple studied this damage carefully, noting how the pattern corresponded to what one might expect if a large piece of flexible material such as a tarpaulin had been stretched across the opening and then removed hastily. Her contemplation was interrupted by the approach of Inspector Slack, who appeared to be conducting his own examination of the area. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said with what might charitably be described as resignation. "I might have expected to find you here." "Good morning, Inspector. I trust your own investigations are proving fruitful." Inspector Slack regarded the broken hedge with professional interest. "Matter of fact, they are. I've been having some rather interesting conversations with the local contractors about their recent activities in this area." "Indeed. And what have you discovered?" "Well, for one thing, it appears that Mr. Fleet's portable lantern has been making regular visits to this location for the past several weeks. Curious thing is, no one seems to have asked him to provide such assistance." Miss Marple considered this information carefully. How public-spirited of him to anticipate the need. "Quite," Inspector Slack agreed. "Though it does raise the question of how he knew the need would arise, given that the lamppost failure appears to have been deliberately arranged." "A fascinating coincidence," Miss Marple murmured. "I don't suppose your conversations revealed any other interesting details?" Inspector Slack produced a small evidence envelope from his pocket. As a matter of fact, they did. "It seems that Fleet Yard has recently experienced a minor theft of materials. Nothing valuable, you understand. Just some rope and canvas fittings. How unfortunate. Was the theft reported?" "Curiously enough, no. Fleet mentioned it only when I asked specifically about missing equipment." Inspector Slack's tone suggested he found this omission significant. Claimed it was too trivial to bother the police with. Miss Marple examined the broken toggle in her palm with renewed interest. "I wonder, Inspector, whether Mrs. Fleet might be able to identify this. She seems quite knowledgeable about rope fittings and such equipment." "My thoughts exactly, Miss Marple," he replied, "though I suspect she may prove somewhat less forthcoming than her husband when it comes to explaining how such items came to be scattered about the countryside." Chapter 6. The Sack with White Dust Doctor. Haydock had completed his examination of poor Amos Keene by the time Miss Marple and Inspector Slack arrived at the old chalk pit. The body had been moved to more suitable accommodations, but the doctor remained at the scene, making final notes in his characteristic, meticulous manner. "Straightforward case of cranial fracture," he announced without preamble, adjusting his spectacles as he consulted his notebook. "Consistent with a fall from the pit edge. Death would have been instantaneous." Inspector Slack nodded grimly. "Any indication he might have been pushed?" "Difficult to say with certainty. The injuries are consistent with either scenario. Though I must say it's a curious place for a man of Keene's habits to be wandering about after dark." Miss Marple had been examining the chalk pit's edge with her usual methodical attention to detail. The excavation was perhaps 30 feet across and 20 deep, its white walls gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. A low wooden rail provided minimal protection from the drop, though it had clearly seen better days. "Dr. Haydock," she said quietly, "I wonder if you might indulge an old woman's curiosity about Mr. Keene's clothing." Did you notice anything unusual about the condition of his garments? The doctor looked up from his notes with interest. As a matter of fact, yes. His cuffs were quite dusty with some sort of fine white powder. I assumed it was chalk from the pit. Naturally enough. Naturally. Though I wonder if you might have retained a sample for examination. Dr. Haydock produced a small envelope from his medical bag. Standard procedure. Though I can tell you now, it's not ordinary chalk dust. When I breathed on it, the material showed a distinct warming reaction. Miss Marple accepted the envelope carefully and examined its contents. The powder was indeed fine and white, but when she followed Dr. Haydock's suggestion and allowed her warm breath to play across it, the material began to steam very slightly. Quicklime, she said with satisfaction, freshly prepared by the evidence of that reaction. Quicklime? Inspector Slack frowned. That's building lime, isn't it? Before it's been slaked with water? Precisely. Highly caustic in its raw state and quite distinctive in its properties. Miss Marple sealed the envelope carefully. One doesn't encounter quicklime by accident, Inspector. It requires deliberate handling. Dr. Haydock nodded agreement. Dangerous stuff if you don't know what you're about. Can cause severe burns if it contacts moisture on the skin. Miss Marple had returned her attention to Keen's effects, which Inspector Slack had arranged on a clean cloth nearby. The dead man's boots, in particular, seemed to hold considerable interest for her. Inspector, she said eventually, might I direct your attention to these boot soles? Both men crouched beside her to examine the footwear more closely. On the left boot, clearly impressed into the leather, was a rectangular mark that appeared to have been stamped rather than worn. Square impression, Inspector Slack observed. Sharp edges, like it was pressed into the sole with considerable force. And see the pattern within the square, Miss Marple added, tracing the outline with her finger. It appears to be the seam pattern one might find on a heavy sack, the sort used for bulk materials like lime or cement. Dr. Haydock leaned closer. You're suggesting he stepped on a sack, or was placed upon one, Miss Marple replied quietly. The impression is remarkably clear for something that occurred during a fall. The right boot proved equally informative, bearing on its sole a smear of black terry material that had not been present when Keen left the Blue Boar on his final evening. Tar again, Inspector Slack muttered. Same as we found on that barley straw in the hedge. Miss Marple rose slowly, her mind clearly working through the implications of these discoveries. I think, gentlemen, that a visit to Fleet Yard might prove illuminating, particularly to examine their lime storage arrangements. The three of them made their way back through the village, where the afternoon shadows were beginning to lengthen. Fleet's haulage yard occupied a substantial plot behind the main street, its gates standing open to reveal stacks of building materials protected by weathered tarpaulins. They found Horace Fleet directing the unloading of a timber delivery, his voice carrying clearly across the yard as he supervised the work. He greeted them with his usual hearty manner, though Miss Marple detected a certain constraint in his demeanor. Inspector, Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock, he said, wiping his hands on a piece of sacking. Terrible business about poor Keen. Can't understand what he was doing out at the chalk pit. We're hoping to establish his movements on the night he died, Inspector Slack replied. I don't suppose you saw him that evening? Fleet shook his head firmly. Can't say as I did. Tuesday evenings I'm usually home with the missus, going over the week's accounts. Miss Marple's attention had been drawn to a large covered area near the back of the yard where several substantial heaps of material lay. Beneath protective sheeting, might I ask what you keep stored under those covers, Mr. Fleet? Building lime, mostly bagged cement, sand, that sort of thing. Have to keep it dry, you understand, or it's ruined for use. Inspector Slack approached the covered storage area and lifted one corner of the nearest sheet. Beneath lay a collection of heavy paper sacks, each clearly labeled as containing quicklime. Several of the sacks showed signs of recent handling, with fine white dust clinging to their surfaces. "Been doing much building work lately?" the inspector inquired. Fleet nodded. "Always something needing repair around the village, though I must say the wet weather's been hard on the stored materials." Miss Marple had noticed something that made her pause. The sheet that covered the lime storage bore distinct fingerprints in the white dust that coated its surface, and the pattern of disturbance suggested recent and somewhat hurried handling. "Mr. Fleet," she said pleasantly, "I wonder if you might show us how you normally handle these materials." I confess to being curious about the precautions one must take with such caustic substances. Fleet appeared somewhat reluctant, but led them to where a partially opened sack sat on a wooden pallet. "Standard procedure," he explained, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Keep them off the ground to prevent moisture damage. Cover them against the weather." Inspector Slack was examining the open sack more closely. "This one seems to have burst," he observed. "Happens sometimes. Poor quality bags or rough handling during delivery." Miss Marple knelt beside the damaged sack and studied the torn seam carefully. The paper had indeed split along its stitched edge, but what caught her attention was a tiny dark stain on the inner fold of the material, barely visible, but distinctly present. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe you should examine this more closely." Inspector Slack produced his magnifying glass and studied the stain she indicated. After a long moment, he straightened with a grim expression. "That appears to be blood, Mr. Fleet. Fresh blood, and not much of it, but definitely present." Fleet's face had gone considerably paler. "Blood? I can't imagine how that might have occurred. These sacks come to us sealed from the supplier." Miss Marple rose slowly, her keen eyes taking in every detail of Fleet's increasingly uncomfortable demeanor. "Perhaps," she suggested gently, "there's been some sort of accident that you haven't yet mentioned to the authorities." Chapter 7. Luminous mark on the post. The tension in Fleet's yard had become almost palpable following the discovery of the blood-stained lime sack. Horace Fleet's usual bluff heartiness had evaporated entirely, leaving behind a man who seemed suddenly older and considerably less certain of himself. "I think," said Inspector Slack with deliberate formality, "that we should continue this conversation at the station. Mr. Fleet." "Now see here," Fleet began, but his protest lacked conviction. "There's a perfectly reasonable explanation for all of this." Miss Marple, who had been studying the arrangement of materials in the yard with her characteristic thoroughness, looked up with mild interest. "I'm sure there is, Mr. Fleet, though I wonder if that explanation might be more clearly demonstrated after darkness falls." Inspector Slack regarded her with surprise. "After dark, Miss Marple?" "Indeed," she replied gently. "I have a theory about the luminous chalk we discovered, and theories are best tested under the conditions in which they would naturally operate." Miss Marple adjusted her handbag with the sort of decisive movement that suggested she had reached an important conclusion. "Might I suggest we reconvene at Stile Lane this evening, just as twilight begins to settle?" The suggestion seemed to disturb Fleet considerably more than the prospect of immediate arrest. "Evening?" he stammered. "I don't see what good that would accomplish." "Oh, but I think you do, Mr. Fleet," Miss Marple replied gently. "I think you understand perfectly well what we might discover there." Dr. Haydock, who had been listening to these exchanges with growing fascination, cleared his throat diplomatically. "If we're to stage some sort of demonstration, I should very much like to be present. Professional curiosity, you understand." "By all means," Inspector Slack agreed. "Though I warn you all, if this proves to be some sort of wild goose chase, I assure you, Inspector, it will be anything but that." Miss Marple's voice held a quiet confidence that somehow made her assurance more compelling than any amount of theatrical protestation might have been. As the afternoon wore on toward evening, word of the impending demonstration somehow spread through the village with a sort of supernatural efficiency that characterizes small communities, faced with genuine excitement. By the time Miss Marple and her companions assembled at the entrance to Stile Lane, they had acquired an audience that included Lady Bantry, the Clements, and several other curious villagers. The October evening was crisp and clear, with just enough cloud cover to promise genuine darkness once the sun completed its descent. Inspector Slack had arranged for Constable Sanders to bring additional lanterns, though Miss Marple had specifically requested that these remain unlit until her demonstration was complete. "Now then," she said, addressing the small gathering as they stood near lamppost 14, "I believe we can recreate the conditions that prevailed during the recent incidents. Inspector, might I trouble you to dampen the base of this lamppost with a bit of water from your flask?" Inspector Slack complied, though with evident skepticism. The water darkened the paint and concrete at the post foundation, creating a small area of moisture that gleamed faintly in the dying light. Almost immediately, a ghostly glow began to emanate from the dampened surface, pale but unmistakably visible in the gathering dusk. "Good heavens," breathed Dr. Haydock. "The luminous chalk." "Precisely," Miss Marple confirmed. "Someone has been using this material to mark exact positions. But there should be another mark as well." She led the group across the lane to the gate stone that marked the entrance to Farmer Henderson's field. "Inspector, if you would be so kind." The same treatment produced the same result. A second glowing mark became visible on the stone surface, positioned at precisely the height one would expect to find the rear of a commercial vehicle. Lady Bantry stared at the glowing marks with obvious unease. "Jane, what does this mean?" "It means, my dear Dolly, that someone has been taking very careful measurements. These marks would allow a driver to position a vehicle with extraordinary precision, even in complete darkness." Inspector Slack was beginning to understand the implications. "You're suggesting someone backed a vehicle between these 2 points?" "More than that, Inspector, I believe someone created a most ingenious deception by doing so." Miss Marple moved to stand between the 2 glowing marks, a slight figure, almost lost in the deepening shadows. "Consider what would happen if a large vehicle, perhaps a lorry, were reversed so that its tailboard came to rest precisely between these marked positions." She gestured toward the hawthorn hedge that bordered the lane. "If one were then to stretch a tarpaulin from the rear of the vehicle to the hedge, creating a sort of canvas wall across the opening, what would be the effect?" The vicar, who had been following her reasoning with growing comprehension, spoke up suddenly. "Good Lord. It would look as though the lane continued, but anyone stepping forward would actually be stepping into the vehicle." "Exactly so, Reverend Clement. A door made of darkness, just as Molly described. Someone standing in the lane and whispering, 'This way to the vicarage,' could guide unsuspecting victims directly into what they believed was the continuation of their path." Fleet, who had been listening to this explanation with obvious distress, finally found his voice. "That's all theoretical nonsense. You can't prove any of it." Miss Marple turned to regard him with gentle sympathy. "Oh, but I rather think we can, Mr. Fleet. You see, such a deception would require not only the luminous chalk for positioning, but also someone with considerable skill in handling tarpaulins and ropes, someone familiar with the sort of knots and hitches that would hold a canvas wall securely in place. Inspector?" Slack had produced his notebook and was making rapid entries by the light of his pocket torch. "Someone like Mrs. Fleet, you mean? Given her expertise with rope work?" "Indeed. Though I suspect the planning was a collaborative effort." Miss Marple paused to allow the implications to settle over the group. The removal of the fuse from lamppost 15 would ensure that this section remained conveniently dark. The provision of alternative lighting would establish a pattern of helpful presence in the area, and the careful marking of positions would allow the deception to be set up and removed with military precision. Dr. Haydock shook his head in amazement. But why go to such elaborate lengths? Surely there are simpler ways to rob people? But this wasn't simply about robbery, Dr. Haydock. At least not in the case of poor Mr. Keene. Miss Marple's voice became grave. I believe the first two incidents were what one might call rehearsals. Practice runs to perfect the technique and test the nerve required. Fleet's face had gone white in the growing darkness. You're talking about murder? I'm afraid so, Mr. Fleet, though I suspect it began as something rather less sinister. Miss Marple regarded him with the sort of compassionate understanding that made confession almost inevitable. Perhaps you could tell us about the invoice Mr. Keene was carrying that evening. The silence that followed this question seemed to stretch for an eternity. Around them, the village sounds of evening began to assert themselves, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind in the hedge, the faint chime of the church clock marking the quarter hour. Finally, Fleet's shoulders sagged in defeat. He was going to ruin me, he said quietly. That invoice proved I'd been claiming for work I hadn't done, night call-outs for lamp repairs that never happened. So you created the very faults you claimed to be fixing, Inspector Slack said, stepping closer. It started during the war years, Fleet continued, his voice barely audible. Everyone was making arrangements, finding ways to get by. Nobody questioned a few extra charges here and there. But Keene noticed the pattern. He had copies of all the invoices. Miss Marple nodded with sad understanding. And he threatened to expose you unless you paid him to keep quiet. The Chronicle would have printed the story. Fraud charges would have followed. Everything Bess and I worked for, gone. Fleet's voice broke slightly. I never meant for him to die. It was supposed to be like the others, just a scare and a robbery. But he recognized my voice, started shouting about calling the police. The confession hung in the air like a physical presence, heavy with the weight of wasted lives and broken trust. Inspector Slack moved forward with his handcuffs, but his face showed no satisfaction in the arrest, only a profound weariness at human folly. As the small procession made its way back toward the village, Miss Marple found herself walking beside Lady Bantry, both women subdued by the evening's revelations. I shall never look at a dark lane the same way again, Lady Bantry murmured. Miss Marple patted her friend's arm gently. Darkness is only frightening when we don't understand what hides within it, my dear. Once brought to light, even the most elaborate deceptions prove to be surprisingly fragile things. Chapter 8. The Van That Wasn't. Their fleet's partial confession had satisfied Inspector Slack's immediate requirements, but Miss Marple found herself troubled by several loose threads that remained conspicuously unwoven in the fabric of the case. The following morning found her once again making her way through the village, though this time her destination was the Blue Boar public house. Elsie Ray was polishing glasses behind the bar when Miss Marple entered, her movements mechanical and her expression troubled. The events of the previous evening had clearly unsettled the entire village, and nowhere was this more evident than in the subdued atmosphere of what was normally the community's most convivial gathering place. Morning, Miss Marple, Elsie said, managing a wan smile. Terrible business about Mr. Fleet, though I can't say I'm entirely surprised. If I'm being honest, Miss Marple settled herself at a small table near the window, where the morning light would be sufficient for the delicate needlework she had brought along. Indeed. Elsie, I wonder if you might help me understand something about Mr. Keene's final evening here. Elsie's hand stilled on the glass she was polishing. What sort of thing would you like to know? Well, I understand he left here carrying some sort of document, a brown envelope, perhaps. That's right. Been boasting about it all evening. Said he had a paper that would finish Fleet once and for all. Elsie's expression grew distasteful. Nasty way to talk, if you ask me. Whatever Mr. Fleet might have done, there's no call for gloating. Miss Marple's needles began their gentle clicking as she worked on what appeared to be a small white doily. Did Mr. Keene mention what sort of paper it was? Oh, yes, he was quite specific. Some kind of invoice, he said, with false hours marked down. Claimed it proved Mr. Fleet had been charging the council for work he'd never done. And what time did he leave? Elsie consulted the large clock that dominated the bar's back wall. 20 minutes to 9. Makes no difference. I remember because I was just thinking about calling last orders when he got up to go. Miss Marple paused in her needlework to consider this information carefully. I don't suppose anyone followed him out? Not that I noticed. To be fair, it was a busy evening. Half the village seemed to be in here, escaping their own firesides. After completing her conversation with Elsie, Miss Marple made her way to Fleet's yard, where she found Inspector Slack engaged in a methodical search of the premises. The inspector looked up from examining a collection of rope ends with evident frustration. Morning, Miss Marple. I don't suppose you've come to confess to something I've missed. Not precisely. Inspector, though I do have a theory about Mrs. Fleet's involvement that I should like to test. Miss Marple indicated a wastebasket that sat in the corner of the yard office. Might I examine the contents of that receptacle? Inspector Slack gestured toward the basket with weary resignation. By all means, though I've already been through it twice. Without finding anything of significance, Miss Marple began removing items. From the basket, with a sort of careful attention, she might have devoted to sorting her embroidery silks. Among the usual detritus of a working office, she found several lengths of tarred string, some crumpled invoices, and a collection of small paper fragments that might have been torn from larger documents. It was one of these fragments that caught and held her attention. The piece was roughly triangular, no larger than a postage stamp, and bore what appeared to be a small smear of the luminous chalk they had discovered at the lamppost. More intriguingly, one corner of the fragment showed the clear impression of a greasy thumbprint. Inspector, she said quietly, I believe this may be significant. Inspector Slack examined the fragment through his magnifying glass. Looks like it might have been torn from an envelope. Brown paper, I'd say, and recently handled by someone with rather grubby fingers. Someone who had been working with luminous chalk, judging by that smear. The inspector's expression grew thoughtful. You think this came from Keene's envelope? I think it highly probable. The question is, how did it come to be in Fleet's wastebasket? Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Constable Sanders, who approached with the sort of purposeful stride that suggested important news. Inspector, he called out, I've had a word with young Jimmy Fletcher about Tuesday evening, the lad who found Keene's body at the chalk pit. Yes. What did he have to say? Well, sir, it seems Jimmy was out rather later than his parents knew. Poaching rabbits, if you must know, though I've had a word with him about that. The thing is, he saw Fleet's lorry on the road near the chalk pit around 10 that night. Fleet's lorry? He told us he was home with his wife that evening. Yes, sir. That's what made it stick in the boy's mind. He thought it was odd to see the lorry out so late, especially since it was moving without lights. Miss Marple looked up from her examination of the paper fragment. Without lights, you say? That's right, Miss Marple. Jimmy said he only spotted it because the moon came out from behind the clouds just as it was passing. Gave him quite a fright, apparently. The three of them made their way to the section of Fleet's yard where the vehicles were kept. The lorry in question sat beneath a canvas shelter, its dark bulk suggesting nothing more sinister than honest commercial transport. However, closer examination revealed details that proved considerably more illuminating. The rear canvas curtain, which would normally hang loose when the vehicle was unloaded, showed clear evidence of recent repair work. Someone had darned a tear in the fabric with the sort of neat, precise stitching that Miss Marple had observed in Mrs. Fleet's rope work. "The same whipping stitch she used on the cord," Miss Marple observed, running her finger along the mended seam, quite distinctive in its execution. "Inspector Slack," called the inspector from within the canvas-covered cargo area. "There's something else here that might interest you." Miss Marple and Constable Sanders peered into the vehicle's depths, where the inspector was indicating what appeared to be a small shelf or ledge built into the side wall. "Store for hand tools and such," Inspector Slack explained, reaching into the compartment. "And what do we have here?" His hand emerged, holding a stick of the luminous chalk they had found traces of throughout their investigation. The material was partially used, with clear finger marks visible in its chalky surface. "Mrs. Fleet mentioned she kept such things for cycling," Miss Marple recalled, "though I suspect its recent use has been rather more specialized." The evidence was mounting with inexorable logic, each piece fitting into place with the sort of, precision that Miss Marple had learned to associate with carefully planned crimes. Yet something in the arrangement continued to trouble her. A sense that important elements of the story remained hidden beneath the surface of Fleet's confession. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "I believe we should speak with Mrs. Fleet before drawing any final conclusions. The physical evidence strongly suggests her direct involvement, but the precise nature of that involvement remains to be clarified." Inspector Slack nodded grimly. "My thoughts exactly, though I suspect we may find her somewhat less forthcoming than her husband proved to be." As they prepared to leave Fleet Yard, Miss Marple found herself taking one last look at the lorry and its telltale repairs. There was something almost tragic about the careful stitch, work that had preserved the canvas while ultimately providing the evidence that would destroy its creator. Such was often the way with crimes that required domestic skills, she reflected. The very competence that made the deception possible ultimately ensured its discovery by those who knew what to look for. Chapter 9. Chalk Pit at Dawn. The confrontation with Mrs. Fleet took place in the austere surroundings of the police station, where Inspector Slack had arranged for a formal interview room to be made available. Miss Marple, having been invited to observe the proceedings, settled herself in a corner chair with her knitting, her presence somehow managing to be both unobtrusive and oddly commanding. Bess Fleet entered the room with the same practical composure she had displayed while securing loads in her husband's yard, though Miss Marple detected a certain rigidity in her bearing that suggested considerable inner tension. She took the offered chair across from Inspector Slack with deliberate precision, her weathered hands folded neatly in her lap. "Mrs. Fleet," Inspector Slack began formally, "I must caution you that anything you say may be taken down and used in evidence. Do you understand this warning?" "I understand it perfectly well, Inspector," Mrs. Fleet replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Though I fail to see why my presence should be required when my husband has already confessed to his involvement in this unfortunate business." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused for just a moment before resuming their gentle rhythm. "I think, Mrs. Fleet, that your husband's confession may have been somewhat incomplete, perhaps deliberately so." Mrs. Fleet's gaze shifted to Miss Marple with what might have been surprise. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean by that." Inspector Slack spread several evidence bags across the table between them. Piece of whipped cordage found in the hedge along Stile Lane, a bone toggle from a tarpaulin curtain discovered in the same location, a fragment of brown paper bearing both luminous chalk and a clear thumbprint Mrs. Fleet examined each item with the sort of careful attention she might have devoted to inspecting rope before purchase. "I see various bits and pieces, Inspector, though I fail to understand their significance." "The cordage," Miss Marple said gently, bears the distinctive whipping technique you demonstrated to me when securing the load on your timber dray. The toggle matches others hanging in your husband's lorry, and the paper fragment appears to have come from the envelope Mr. Keene was carrying when he left the Blue Boar. Circumstantial evidence at best, Mrs. Fleet replied, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Inspector Slack leaned forward across the table. Mrs. Fleet, we have a witness who saw your husband's lorry near the chalk pit on the night Keene died. The vehicle was traveling without lights, which suggests someone was taking considerable care not to be observed. My husband's business often requires him to work unusual hours, Mrs. Fleet said stiffly. At 10 on a Tuesday evening, without lights, carrying what we now know was a man who had been rendered unconscious and possibly already dead. Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded Mrs. Fleet with the sort of compassionate directness that had proven effective in countless previous encounters with troubled souls. My dear, she said quietly, I believe your husband is attempting to protect you by accepting full responsibility for what occurred. But the physical evidence tells a rather different story. Mrs. Fleet's composure wavered slightly. What sort of story? One in which you played a much more active role than he has admitted. Miss Marple retrieved one of the evidence bags and held it up to catch the light. This cordage, for instance. Your husband knows ropes well enough, certainly, but his technique lacks the maritime precision that characterizes your work. This knot was tied by someone with naval training. My father's teaching, Mrs. Fleet said automatically, then caught herself as she realized the admission. Precisely. And the darning on the lorry's canvas curtain shows the same distinctive stitch pattern. Your husband might have planned the deception, but you executed the crucial details that made it possible. Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. We've reconstructed the sequence of events, Mrs. Fleet. Your husband disabled the lamppost and marked the positioning points with luminous chalk. But it was your skill with ropes and canvas that created the moving hedge effect. And when Keene recognized your husband's voice and began struggling, it was your expertise that secured him in the lime sack. Mrs. Fleet's hands clenched involuntarily at this description. You make it sound so calculated, so deliberate, wasn't it? Miss Marple's voice remained gentle despite the gravity of her words. The two previous incidents were rehearsals, opportunities to perfect the technique and test your nerve. By the time you confronted Mr. Keene, you knew exactly how to make someone disappear from Stile Lane. He was going to destroy us, Mrs. Fleet said suddenly, her composure finally cracking. 20 years of building the business, of scrimp and saving and making do, all to be thrown away because of his greed. Inspector Slack made careful notes as Mrs. Fleet continued. Horace thought he could reason with him, convince him to be satisfied with a reasonable payment for his silence. But Keene wanted everything, not just money, but the pleasure of watching us grovel. Miss Marple nodded sadly. So you decided to silence him permanently. It wasn't supposed to end that way, Mrs. Fleet said, her voice barely above a whisper. The plan was to frighten him, take the invoice and leave him confused and empty-handed, like the others. But when he saw Horace in the lorry, when he started shouting about calling the police, you struck him with something heavy, Inspector Slack replied. Probably a tool from the lorry's equipment box. Mrs. Fleet closed her eyes as if trying to shut out the memory. A tire iron just once to stop his shouting. I never meant to kill him. But once he was unconscious, Miss Marple observed, you had to decide what to do with him. And that's when you thought of the chalk pit. Horace wanted to take him to a doctor, claim he'd been found injured by the roadside. But I knew it wouldn't work. The evidence on his clothes, the circumstances, it had to look like an accident. Inspector Slack's pen scratched steadily across his notebook. So you wrapped him in a lime sack to contain any bleeding, drove him to the chalk pit and threw him over the rail. Mrs. Fleet's shoulders began to shake with suppressed emotion. I told myself it was mercy. He was probably dying anyway from the head injury. At least this way, it would be quick. Miss Marple reached across the table and touched Mrs. Fleet's clenched hands with surprising gentleness. But it wasn't mercy, my dear. It was murder. And now your husband is prepared to hang for a crime that you committed. The confession that followed was complete and methodical, delivered in the same precise manner that Mrs. Fleet brought to all her undertakings. She detailed the planning, the execution, and the disposal of evidence with the sort of thoroughness that would have been admirable in any other context. As Inspector Slack completed the formalities of the arrest, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the tragedy of competence misdirected. The very skills that had made Mrs. Fleet an invaluable partner in her husband's business had ultimately provided the means for their mutual destruction. "Inspector," she said as they prepared to leave the station, "I trust you'll ensure that Mr. Fleet's sentencing takes into account his wife's confession. Whatever his failings, he shouldn't pay the ultimate price for her crime." Inspector Slack nodded grimly. "Justice will take its proper course, Miss Marple. Though I can't help feeling that everyone involved in this business has paid a price far higher than the original crime warranted." Miss Marple gathered her knitting with thoughtful precision. "That," she observed quietly, "is so often the way with secrets, Inspector. The cost of keeping them eventually exceeds any possible benefit they might have provided." Chapter 10. Who Turned Off the Light? 3 evenings later, Miss Marple found herself once again in the familiar comfort of the vicarage sitting room, surrounded by the same collection of village worthies who had gathered to discuss the mysterious happenings in Stile Lane. The atmosphere, however, had undergone a considerable transformation. Where before there had been nervous speculation and mounting fear, now there existed the sort of subdued satisfaction that follows the resolution of a particularly troubling puzzle. "I must confess," said the Reverend Clement, settling back in his favorite armchair, "that I find myself both relieved and rather ashamed. Relieved that the mystery has been solved, but ashamed that I suspected supernatural intervention when the explanation was so thoroughly human in its origins." Lady Bantry adjusted her shawl with characteristic briskness. "Nonsense, Leonard. There was nothing natural about what those people did. Creating doors out of darkness, indeed." "It sounds like something from a Gothic romance." Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their gentle rhythm as she worked on what appeared to be a soft blue cardigan. "On the contrary, Dolly, I found the method quite ingeniously practical. Though I must say, the psychological elements were far more complex than the mechanical ones." Dr. Haydock, who had been unusually quiet throughout the evening, looked up from his contemplation of the fire. "You mean the way Fleet was prepared to accept responsibility for his wife's crime?" "Indeed. Though I suspect that arrangement would not have lasted long under rigorous legal scrutiny. The physical evidence was simply too specific to Mrs. Fleet's particular skills." Griselda leaned forward with the sort of eager attention she reserved for the most fascinating village gossip. "Miss Marple, would you mind explaining exactly how they managed it? I understand the basic principle, but the details still seem quite bewildering." Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded the assembled group with a patient expression she might have worn while explaining a particularly intricate embroidery pattern. "Certainly, my dear, though I should warn you that the method, once understood, rather destroys the mysterious atmosphere that made it so effective." She rose and moved to the window, where the gathering darkness of evening was beginning to settle over the village. The fundamental principle was deception through misdirection. By removing the electrical cartridge from Lamppost 15's control box, Fleet ensured that the section between the two lamps remained conveniently dark. "But surely," interrupted Dr. Haydock, "someone would eventually investigate the fault?" "Oh, but someone did investigate it," Miss Marple replied with a slight smile. "Fleet himself, in his capacity as a local contractor with official access to the electrical fittings. He could report the fault, examine it, attempt repairs, and delay the final resolution indefinitely, while appearing entirely helpful and public-spirited. The vicar nodded slowly. Hence the portable lantern he provided for Farmer Giles's milk deliveries. Precisely. It established his presence in the area as both natural and benevolent, while simultaneously ensuring that he would be familiar with the precise timing of local traffic patterns. Lady Bantry frowned thoughtfully. But how did they actually make people disappear? Miss Marple returned to her chair and resumed her knitting. By creating what appeared to be a continuation of Stile Lane, but which was actually the interior of their lorry. They would reverse the vehicle between the two luminous chalk marks, positioning its tailboard precisely between lamppost 14 and the gate stone. Opposite, the chalk marks that glowed in the dark, Griselda said with evident fascination. Indeed, Mrs. Fleet's maritime training made her particularly adept at precise positioning under difficult conditions. Once the lorry was in place, they would stretch a black tarpaulin from the vehicle's rear to the hedge, creating what appeared to be solid darkness, but was actually a canvas wall with an opening behind it. Dr. Haydock leaned forward with professional interest. So when someone approached the dark section, they would see what appeared to be the normal continuation of the lane, with unusually solid shadows on either side. A voice calling "this way to the vicarage" would seem to come from the darkness ahead, guiding them directly into the lorry's cargo area. The vicar shook his head in amazement. Ingenious, certainly, but requiring considerable preparation and perfect timing. Oh yes, Miss Marple agreed, which is why the first two incidents were clearly rehearsals. They needed to test both the mechanical aspects of the deception and their own nerve under actual conditions. Lady Bantry had been following this explanation with growing unease. But Jane, what made you suspect the Fleet specifically? Surely other people had access to the necessary materials and knowledge? Miss Marple's needles paused for a moment as she considered the question. Several factors, really. The quality of the rope work found in the hedge suggested professional expertise of a particular type. The timing of Fleet's helpful provision of lighting coincided rather too neatly with the lamppost failure. And the pattern of damage to the hedge indicated that something substantial had been repeatedly stretched across the opening. The torn tarpaulin fragments, began Inspector Slack, who had joined them, arriving just in time to hear the latter part of the explanation. Good evening. Inspector, the vicar said warmly. I trust the legal proceedings are advancing satisfactorily. Inspector Slack accepted the offered chair with evident weariness. As well as can be expected under the circumstances, Mrs. Fleet's confession has simplified matters considerably, though the tragic waste of it all continues to trouble me. Miss Marple looked up from her, knitting with sympathetic understanding. I believe, Inspector, that the real tragedy began years ago, during the war, when so many people convinced themselves that small deceptions were acceptable necessities. The fraudulent invoices, Dr. Haydock observed. Precisely. What began as minor financial irregularities gradually escalated into something far more serious. By the time Keene discovered the pattern and threatened exposure, the Fleets felt they had too much to lose to allow the truth to emerge. Griselda shuddered delicately. How dreadful it must have been for them, planning such elaborate deceptions. I suspect, Miss Marple said quietly, that they told themselves it was merely a matter of retrieving the incriminating documents and frightening Keene into silence. The escalation to violence was probably as much a surprise to them as it was tragic for poor Keene. Inspector Slack nodded grimly. Mrs. Fleet maintains that striking him was purely instinctive, her reaction to his shouting, rather than premeditated murder. Which may well be true, Miss Marple replied, though the decision to dispose of his body at the chalk pit was clearly calculated to conceal their involvement. The room fell into contemplative silence as each person absorbed the implications of the case. Outside, the village was settling into its evening rhythms, lights beginning to appear in windows, the sound of distant voices carrying on the crisp October air. Lady Bantry was the first to break the quiet. "I must say, Jane, I shall never feel quite the same about walking down a dark lane. How does one know when shadows are merely shadows, and when they might be something else entirely?" Miss Marple smiled gently as she folded her knitting and prepared to take her leave. "I think, my dear Dolly, that the answer lies in maintaining both vigilance and common sense. True shadows behave according to natural laws, while artificial ones often reveal their nature to careful observation." She paused at the door to add with characteristic wisdom, "Night is often a curtain, as I mentioned before. One must see who hung it, and who took out the little fuse that ought to have kept it back." As Miss Marple made her way home through the village streets, she noticed with satisfaction that Stile Lane was once again properly illuminated. The council had wasted no time in restoring the damaged lamppost to full function, and the space between the two lights now showed nothing more sinister than an ordinary country lane bordered by hawthorn hedges. Yet she found herself pausing at the entrance to look down the now harmless path, reflecting on how easily the familiar could be transformed into the threatening through human artifice and desperation. It was a lesson worth remembering, she thought, in a world where appearances so often deceived, and where the greatest mysteries frequently lay not in supernatural intervention, but in the complex motivations of ordinary people pressed beyond their moral limits. The village clock struck 9 as Miss Marple reached her cottage door, its chimes echoing across the quiet streets with reassuring regularity. Order had been restored. Justice would take its course, and St. Mary Mead could return to its customary peaceful rhythms. It was, she reflected with quiet satisfaction, exactly as it should be.